would say, depression. And when we talk about human rights, I think that the beginning of the 90s was a sort of a romantic time in the United Nations. This was the end of the Cold War, and this was equally important end of apartheid. And I think this helped the international community to start again to believe that something can be done. And in this overall framework, the Second World Conference on Human Rights organized by the United Nations took place in Vienna. And I had the privilege to be the general rapporteur of this conference. So it gave me the opportunity to get involved not only in a narrow area, but rather across the board what the conference was doing. And then I moved afterwards to the Office of the High Commissioner. So this was first was the diplomatic experience, academic experience, diplomatic experience, and then international organization experience, because the newly established Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was filled by an Ecuadorian diplomat, Lasso, and he invited me to join him as a senior advisor, and I stayed. I went there for 2 years, and I stayed there for 11 years. And it was a great experience for me to see how this, the human rights advocacy, international advocacy institution works, to see it from inside. And it was really very, very interesting. And then retired from this institution, I went back to Poland, and I started again my academic walk of life. And this gave me the opportunity to join the, at that time, European Center for Human Rights and Democratization, which we, together with Mike and other friends, we gradually changed into a global endeavor. And this is a global campus of human rights. I think a unique institution of 7 regional programs in human rights and democratization, a unique and extremely encouraging, because this is a living example or manifestation of the possibility to work together from different angles and go together to the same aim, protection of people. So I think the global campus is for me somewhat a crowning point of my dreams for quite a long time. And I'm extremely happy that I still can, in one or another way, do something in this framework. So this is what the global campus, you know probably that these are 7 regional programs. And I think we are rather at the beginning of the road than at the end. Because at the beginning of the road, I mean, we, a group of you, like yours, a group of students in one region, taking into account the potential of people, similar people in other regions, we can expect that we can take projects, we can take some initiatives which could really influence the life of people on the ground globally. This is a unique resource center, I would say, this global campus. And for example, just not to talk only about theory, you are taking part in the program, educational program, but this educational program is linked to practice as well. And I'm sure that, for example, if we can somewhat combine interests and engagement in all these regional programs. For example, for such a project like economic, social, cultural rights of children, then we can work on it from different regional perspectives, but also focusing on what is really going on the ground, what the United Nations treaty bodies can do in this respect, for example, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, I think we can contribute to a change. And this is something which I find fascinating. Once again, we still are in the process of, I would say, the initial process of exploring the entire potential of this institution, which is Global Campus. But I am very confident that we will progress on this way in a quite effective, in a quite effective way. Mike, one question now. How much time do we have? Because
yeah, so we've got an hour. We'll finish at about 3 o'clock Bangkok time, which will be 10 o'clock your time. So we've got another 15
so
minutes.
I'm stopping at that because this time limits are always crucial for us. By the way, I don't know whether you know who is the most powerful in all the international debates in the United Nations.
No, I don't. Who would that be?
Interpreters.
All right.
Because they finish their work, for example, at 1 o'clock, because they are starting lunchtime, and whatever happens in the room, they are saying sorry and switching off. So this is why I'm paying a lot of attention to the time limits because I know how it works.
Right.
I'm a member still of the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, by the way, and but this is the last year of my membership, and this is at the same time the 12th year. So I spent 3 terms in the committee. I had the privilege and honor to be the chair of the committee for a time. So it's quite a long time, and certainly this is a time to go in such a situation. But it will be a pleasure for me to answer your questions related to all areas of my, let's say, professional experience, or provided certainly that I will know the responses. Okay, this is what I wanted to say. Mike.
Great. So the case study is interesting, and the students have read it. And I think I'm going to get, if I can ask Yogi to give a bit of an opening about what you thought about the case study and what the main issues are, and in terms of the finding, and then we'll turn over to the students. So Yogi, how did you go with the case study?
Yeah, thank you, Agent Mike, and thank you, Prof. Dzidek. Regarding the case study, I got the insight that was the case about individuals versus the private sector, which is business. And from the case, I would like to ask about the recommendation. Does this recommendation by the committee under the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is enough to change the regulation of Italy regarding human rights and businesses? Because as we all know that this is only a recommendation that has a very weak implication for the bigger picture of the law in Italy, or maybe in the world regarding the human business and human rights. Could you please explain about it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The recommendations don't have as such an obligatory power. It means that our recommendations, the committee's recommendations, are don't create legal commitments per se. One can say so. But one can also raise doubts about this assessment, because they are not a legal obligation like law or a verdict of a court, because we are not a court. But nevertheless, if you look at the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, each state which has ratified the covenant and has ratified the protocol, in fact, entered the legal commitments to do everything under the Vienna Convention Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties to undertake everything in the good faith to implement or to follow the commitments made, implement the treaty. So this means, in my view, that recommendations of the committee, although they are not, once again, judgments of a court, but nevertheless, state parties to the covenant and to the optional protocol enter into the commitment to fulfill them and to follow them. So this is what is a general assessment. Now the question is how to ensure that the state parties really follow on these recommendations. The committee has established something which is called follow-up procedure. This means that we are examining how state parties react to our recommendations, and we prepare reports on the conduct of the state parties. We have not done it yet with regard to the case which I sent to you, because this is a rather new case. We decided upon this case last year. So we have to give, this is our general approach, that we are giving a state some 18-24 months for reacting to our recommendations. Because changes in law is not a simple process. It's easier sometimes when we expect the state parties to take practical steps and to refrain, for example, from the infringements with rights and with existing laws. But if the law system should be changed, we need to give more time to the state. So this is, we probably will take, the committee will take this case up next year, and then follow on it and ask the government of Italy to provide full information about the implementation of our recommendations. So this is how this looks like. And I don't know whether this response is satisfactory or not.
No,
Can I ask one more?
If you have
Can
any
I ask one more
additional questions,
question?
please feel free. I will be happy to
Yeah, can
continue.
I add one more question, Prof?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, regarding the business and human rights, because it's also the phenomenon that I got from the case. As the international law about business and human rights are still is still ongoing process. Can we use the guiding principles on the business and human rights to, what we call it, like to make a legally binding of this case, or in, I think of this case, like individuals against the versus the private sectors, or it will be like back as a recommendation, as long as you will follow the recommendation, and then you can do it, but if you don't, there's no like such punishment, something like that.
Yeah. You know, with regard to the business and human rights, the guiding principles, you know, the condition for the adoption of the guiding principles, in fact, and this was an agreement certainly among the states who voted for it in the Human Rights Council, was that it would not be a legally binding document. So to change the guiding principles into a legally binding document, it would be very difficult, or to interpret it in this way. I think that when we are talking about a case where the state involved is a state party to the covenant on economic, social, cultural rights, I would say that a more effective way would be the reference to the general comment of the committee, number 24, on business and human rights. Because the general comments, they are not source of law as such, but they are recognized internationally as authoritative interpretation of the covenant. So, in fact, when you refer to the General Common 24 on business, because the title of this General Common is the state obligations, state parties' obligations in the context of business activities. Okay, if you refer to this general comment, you can say you are referring to the covenant, because this is just the interpretation of the covenant. And legally speaking, the general comment is much more precise, much more specific, and you can say, I would look at it from the following point of view. On the one hand, when you are talking about the political commitments, it's probably better to refer to guiding principles, because guiding principles have been adopted by the political bodies of the United Nations, endorsed by the General Assembly. So this is a political commitment. If you are talking about legal commitments of states, then with regard to state parties to the covenant, I would rather tend to refer to the General Common number 24, because it is, legally speaking, much more precise. This General Common does not use the compromise language, which is typical for the various guidelines adopted by the Human Rights Council. Because this compromise language is a condition for the adoption of the resolution, usually in the Human Rights Council. So I would, when you want to be on the legal ground, I would definitely prefer to use the General Common number 24, providing certainly that the state party you are talking about is party to the international covenant.
Great, thanks for that answer. Now next we've got Sidra. Sidra, you've got a question. Do you want to also just give yourself a little introduction, Sidra?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Ajahn Mike. My name is Sidra and I'm from Pakistan. And it's not a question, but a comment which or understanding which we had previously in our group when we were discussing the case study. So can I leave the share a comment, or only question is there to ask?
No, sharing a comment's fine.
Yeah. Okay. The thing is that case study was very interesting when we discussed them in our group. And when it was discussing about the scientific benefits that any person should enjoy and have that, I was thinking, and we were discussing that maybe it was clashing with some constitution which that country was having at that time. That's why that family was coming again and again and putting their concern. And we came out with this understanding that maybe it was a call for an amendment for that certain country, that they should come up with amendment for the rights of the people, that was clashing against the this covenant. So we just want to share, we would just want to know your opinion about it, that is it a right a conclusion or understanding that we reached while discussing it, or is the amendment is just a thought or just an advocacy tool? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, generally speaking, we have to base our reflection, or let's say our considerations, not reflections so much, but considerations, we should base on the assumption that the domestic law, whether it is constitutional or not, at the international level, in international relations, cannot serve as a justification of the infringement with the international treaties, in this case with the International Covenant. If a state party has a constitution which is in contradiction with the covenant, then the state party has in fact the following choices. Either to amend the constitution or to convince the parties to the treaty to change the treaty or to withdraw the ratification. Certainly, these are, I would say, the rigid principles. But sometimes a country can say and explain, for example, to our committee, our constitution, we know that our constitution is not fully compatible with the covenant. We are aware of that, but the process of the constitutional amendment is a difficult process that requires also the support of the society. We need to work on it and to convince people and so on. So we need time for that. And the committee in such a situation is certainly ready to show, I would say, a lot of patience, giving the state party a chance really to work on it. If there is a good faith, this is a fundamental premise of really international cooperation. So if there is a good faith and the state party is really undertaking to go towards the compatibility of its own law with the covenant, then the committee is available to support the country, to provide advice, is not jumping on the country in order to, to just to be critical. So we have to see it also as a sort, even in situation that the law of the state party contradict the covenant, even in such a situation, we should see the relationship between the committee and the state party as a cooperative relationship. Although we have to be, as a committee, we have to be very clear on the issue of incompatibility. This is how it works, okay? Sorry, I will just change my blends here. Okay, is it okay?
Yep, that's great. Now, I think we've got lots of students who've got questions not about the case study, so maybe we'll wrap up the case study. We didn't really get to talk a lot because I think there was some really interesting details about the recognition of scientific progress, and so I know that there are lots of issues developing around that, particularly with disability. And I know there's been some cases of, say, deaf parents requesting that they have embryo selection to make sure that they have a child who's also deaf, and that was creating a bit of concern. But we may not have a chance to get back to that. But I think now we've got Razi who wants to ask a question, which is more about cultural rights. Razi, are you there? Can you ask your question?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you everyone, and we are really honored to have you here today. It's a very good experience. My question is more about a cultural right. Now, the problem in most of the Asian countries, especially, my name is Razi, I'm from Sri Lanka. So the problem here is some of the public institutions and government institutions, they have some circulars and regulations for the attire of female public officers. For an example, I would say a nurse. So a nurse has already a set out dress code for her. Now, some of the other minorities, especially minority Muslims, when they want to work as a nurse, then they want to wear their cultural dress. Now we have a conflict between the already recognized or allowed attire and these cultural attire they want to add on. Now in these circumstances, now there is a conflict. Now how do we compromise these two? A person's right to wear a cultural attire in a public office where there is a regulation on that. And if a person really asks to wear something to express her cultural right. Will it be okay, or is it allowed? So can she do that, or is it illegal or violation or something like that?
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. Unfortunately, I cannot refer to any jurisprudence of the committee which would have addressed this question. I can tell you that in our discussion in the committee, because this is a question, for example, of the prohibition of burqa in some states in the public places. It is not the same question, but a similar question, okay? That you have the universal rules, the general rules, and you have a specific culture. And which is not only the question of culture in general, but it's a question of identity of people. And we, in the committee in our discussions, the starting point for us is always the protection of people who are in minority. Because, you know, because of the old rule, all the interpretation of the rule majority rule versus minority rights, which is based on the assumption that the majority can defend itself anyway. The minority is in troubles, okay? So this is same here. Once again, we have not articulated the interpretation of the covenant on this issue yet. And we haven't had so far any case brought to our attention in the framework of the complaints procedure. But I would say I can only expect the committee in the future will primarily focus on the protection of the individual and try to reconcile this rights of an individual with the majority or with the general rules in such a way that it would be acceptable to everybody. But I cannot refer to anything more, to any, I would say, firm basis for this response in the jurisprudence of the committee. I can only say that this is a tendency, how we perceive conflicts of this sort. As long as the enjoyment of a culture of a minority creates a problem only with regard to the general law, but does not interfere with the rights of others, the approach would be probably of the committee as I described it. So because sometimes it is a question of the rights of others, but in the situation you described, it is not the case. So I think that the approach of the committee would be rather the tendency would be to put the forefront the individual rights.
But actually, just to add to that, before we go to the next question from Naris, but when the part of the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Committee, would they be kind of, I don't know whether the words like pressured, or would they feel like they've got to make decisions which agree with previous jurisprudence from the ICCPR committee? Because I imagine ICCPR has done stuff on, say, the wearing of clothes. And so would a part of the decision process be, well, we've got to make sure we're not going to start a conflict with ICCPR, or would that not be part of it at all?
No. It's thank you, Mike. It's very, very important that you are drawing our attention to also to the jurisprudence of other committees. I can tell you that always when we are starting the consideration of a case or interpretation of an article, we are first of all we are studying the jurisprudence of other committees. What does not necessarily mean that we must follow the jurisprudence of other committees. By the way, this is an issue because, you know, the world should expect the UN to speak with one voice. And it would be, in my view, pretty hazardous if the committees go in different directions, because this will in fact undermine the value of the views, of the recommendations, of the interpretations of all committees, and the impact of the system of treaty bodies. So I would say, if the committee takes its own way, it must be a very considered step, taking into account all the consequences, and it can happen only if it is absolutely necessary. I would even go one step further. I would say, if the committee decides, it was not, I cannot refer to any practical cases in this respect yet, but let's say in the future, if it happens, that the committee arrives at the conclusion that the position taken by ICCPR or other committees is not acceptable to the committee, then the committee would be well advised if it would enter into discussions with this committee and try to find a common solution, which then would be followed by both committees. You know, we have to take care of the authority of the treaty bodies as well. It is not so that we are talking about isolated, totally isolated bodies. I hope that this helps.
Great. Arno, that's good. So now we've got a question from Naris. Are you there, Naris?
Hello.
Yep. Hi. Okay.
Hello.
Hi from Thailand. This is my questions based on my curiosity about the LGBTQ rights. As you mentioned about the EU region and the Poland background, right? I want to know that like how what is the mechanism that ICE, SCR committee or the EU used to ensure the people right to live equally, and how the ICE, CSR committee defend the rights of LGBTQ individuals in Europe, especially in those countries that still have a gender-based discrimination against the LGBTQ. For instance, in Poland, like in this month that the police have arrested the LGBT right activists for a peaceful protest, and in the Russia is the discrimination by the same-sex marriage law. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I'm really very much concerned and also ashamed that in my country, not only some groups of people, because you can find different groups of people everywhere, but not only some groups of people, but also some, let's say, public bodies, some political forces are inclined to, or not only inclined, but they are in fact putting the LGBTQ rights on the political agenda as a political weapon to win elections, for example, to mobilize their supporters and so on. And this creates certainly, this contributes to the creation of the climate of intolerance. This is out of question. So and I'm ashamed of that. This is really the only thing which I can say, which is somewhat balancing this problem, is that you have very strong movements in the civil society, among NGOs, among, let's say, academia and so on, who are, and also among political groupings, because this is not all the politicians are on this line, who are trying to counter this sort of developments. Unfortunately, we have some representatives of the church, which is pretty powerful in the country, who are also in the first lines of the fight against the rights of the LGBTQ people. They are calling the LGBTQ an ideology. And in this way, it should facilitate, in fact, the campaign against it. So the defense of the rights of these people is based on one simple statement. It is not an ideology, these are people. People must be protected. So this is what, just in general terms, what the committee can do. And I'm expected it to come up in the committee pretty soon. The committee can issue a statement on the issue. First of all, the committee can take up the issue in its dialogues with the state parties in the framework of the reporting procedure. And this is what the committee has been doing already for quite a long time. If you study the concluding observations, this means, in fact, the recommendations of the committee, in particular during the last, I would say, 5-7 years, then you can find a lot of references to the rights of the people. And I think they are very clear, and the committee is very clear in terms of condemning any attempts of discrimination and underlining the need to extend protection to them, and that as an obligation of the states parties under the covenant. But in addition to this, what is in fact the essential work of the committee, this reporting procedure, we haven't yet had any complaint in the framework of the communication procedure concerning the issue. But the committee can do, and this is what I started to say, in fact, the committee can, and I'm expecting it that it will happen rather sooner than later, that the committee will issue either a statement on the question or a general comment. This is, the statement doesn't have the let's say, the full, it's not at the same level as a general comment. The general comment is a authoritative interpretation of the covenant, but nevertheless, the committee can, in the format of a statement, what is a short document, in the format of a statement, the committee can express its views on the issue, in fact, providing the initial interpretation of the covenant. It has not happened yet, but I can expect that it will happen rather sooner than later, as I said.
Great, thanks. Then now we've got a question from Teresa.
Yeah, hello, Ajahn. Thank you, Ajahn and sir. So my question, I have 2 questions.
Just
the first,
a quick introduction of who you are, and then the question.
Okay, so my name is Teresa. I'm from Myanmar. So especially I'm from Kachin ethnic minority group from Myanmar. So my question, I have 2 questions. The first question is regarding about my country, human rights and business issue. So the second question is that about the cases. So I will go through the first question. So the first question is like, I would like to ask about like, as you may know, my country is like, Myanmar is transition from military government to democratic government at the moment. But military state has a lot of power in ruling the country. So the government cannot solve yet the human rights issue, human rights violations against the civilians, not only in conflict area, but also in a business sector. So regarding the business sector, for a decade, like every year, around like 100 or around 100 to 300 people, especially like scavengers, have died because of land skates in the jade mines in Kachin state of Myanmar. So because why this happened? Because like a lot of companies, like jade mining companies, are using a huge machines, and that can affect environmental badly, and they don't manage the piles of soil and other waste systematically. So after the excavation of jade, so that's why people are dying because of that environmental effects. So at the same time, the government doesn't take any action yet to the company, because even the government already ratified the ICESCR, and also the government has law, right? Like for example, Myanmar investment law, something like that. But because why the government cannot address the issue? Because most of the owners of the company, the jade mine companies, are from military background and military family, something like that. So at the same time, government and its military receive a lot of official and unofficial tax from the company and scavengers from those areas. So that's why my question is that what is your suggestions or comments for Myanmar government to address this issue, and how do you see in this case? I'm sure that our democracy government also face a lot of challenges to this issue. So your suggestions might be helpful for our government.
Thank you very much. This is a really complex question, I can imagine. Yeah. I would say Myanmar is a party to the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. And in order not to expand my response too much, the question is extremely interesting, and it's a really complex issue, not just to say it, but the question is, I would say we are facing very often this sort of dilemma. On the one hand, you have the business units which pay taxes, which invest in the country, but they are not acting always in conformity with the rules, with the covenants, and so on. And what to do? The government is saying, okay, we are a little bit, we don't have a free choice, because we are dependent on the income we are receiving from these companies. And I would say, in such a case, a simple response, it doesn't matter, you have to do it. We cannot simplify the issue too much. We have to see this complexity. And while we have to demand from the government to obey the law and to fulfill its obligations, on the other hand, we have to really, and I like the way you posed your question, we have to advise the government what to do. And I would say the first step which I would take in such a situation, I would try to convince the government, in the reference to the General Comment number 24, that the government, under the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, is obliged to introduce a legal obligation of human rights due diligence to its law. This would be the first step which I would try to do. If I would be in a situation like yours, I would try to campaign for that. That this is an obligation of business units of business to carry out or to act with human rights due diligence. And there are some tools. What does it mean to act with due diligence, which are internationally known and recognized? This is the first step which I would do. This is built on the assumption that the government has a goodwill in this respect, but this is itself in difficulties, okay? So we are trying to advise the government, please introduce this tool, because this is your legal obligations, you have to do it. The international law does not impose, I don't want to enter now this discussion because some people are saying it is not so. Please read the General Comment number 24, but if you haven't done it yet. at least it is very controversial if the international law at the moment imposes direct obligations on the business companies. But evidently, covenant in interpretation of contained in the General Comment 24 imposes obligation of the state to introduce this legal obligation of companies to act with human rights due diligence. And this would be the first step. The second step, which I would say could really be helpful to the government. Again, it is not controversial. I would try to convince the government to enter into contacts and cooperation, sort of cooperation, seeking also advice with the Working Group on Business and Human Rights of the Human Rights Council. This is a group of experts composed of 5 people coming from all regions of the world. And they could be extremely helpful in terms of sharing experiences from different countries, which could be relevant to such a situation. This is another issue. And the same, this contact with the working group could be helpful also for the civil society organizations while preparing the contacts with the government. I think this could be a helpful exercise. For the time being, I think this would be probably, when we are talking not about the usual protest actions or something like that, but we are talking about rather cooperative approach, then this probably would be could be somewhat helpful.
Thank you.
And you can also seek advice if you, let's say, if you read the General Comment number 24 and you would like to get more advice on the issue, how to use this general comment, you can approach either the members of the committee, because the committee as such is not providing advice in such individual cases. It's not that easy because this is not a permanent body. But you can approach the members of the committee, and I'm sure everybody in the committee would be happy to provide this sort of advice. You can also approach the OHCHR, and I would, in your place, because there is in OHCHR, there is a unit dealing with business and human rights. So I would, in your case, OHCHR, this is probably known, familiar abbreviation to your Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. In your case, probably I would approach the Secretary of the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, trying to establish contacts. And then you can get an advice how to go about it as well.
Okay, great. Thanks for that answer. And now we've got Gracie. Just remember to give yourself a little introduction before the question.
Hi, yes, thanks, Mike. Sorry, I cannot turn on my video at this moment, but yeah, I am Gracie. I am from the Philippines, and my question is regarding with the an individual filing a case to the committee. In my understanding, before the committee actually acknowledged the admissibility of a case, or before they accept a case, the individual and the state party must exhaust all possible solutions first at the national level. And so this gives me an impression that a committee actually only received few cases. So I'm just very interested if you could give us a monumental case wherein the committee actually favored, or the recommendations of the committee actually favored the individual. And so we could also check how that country like responded to the recommendations of the committee, if there is such a case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gracia. I think it's the question of admissibility is very clearly defined in the optional protocol, And this is obligation of the, there's a question that the committee should check the admissibility. But we had a discussion in the committee whether the committee ex officio should examine all aspects of the admissibility. And definitely the exhaustion of local remedies is a principle in international law which is applicable across the board in international law, not only in the committee. And we need to look into it. But we decided, I don't know whether I can say it even publicly, but, but let's say we are talking as academicians. The committee is in fact of the view that it is not its obligation to examine all aspects of admissibility on its own initiative. It is up to the state party to raise the questions concerning admissibility. Then we can examine these questions. So this is a principal approach is in order to protect the individual, if there are no prima facie contradictions to the principle of admissibility, or the conditions of admissibility, sorry, then we are considering the case. This is the first point, okay? Then what are the problems, the major problems which have been raised so far with regard to admissibility of complaints? The first is, as I said, exhaustion of local remedies. We had recently, in order just to move a little bit to practice, we had recently a case where a man was dismissed from his job, and he was, this was a case from Luxembourg. You can check it on the internet. And he decided not to appeal from the decision of the administrative court of the first instance. He decided not to appeal to the higher instance because, in his view, it didn't make sense, since the jurisprudence so far was in fact against his claims. So he said, if I appeal, I will get again a judgment which would in fact not satisfy me. So why I should lose time and go this entire procedure with appeals and so on ahead? Why I can in fact, resigning from that, go immediately to the committee in order to get the committee's views on that. And the committee said it is not up to the claimant, up to the complainant, to decide not to exhaust the local remedies fully. This is a principle which must be observed. So we declared this case inadmissible in such a situation. So there is another issue which is very often raised by state parties. There's a question that we can consider only cases which concern violations which happened after the entry into force of the optional protocol for the country concerned. And many countries are saying, wait a moment, the decision, for example, depriving somebody of pension took place before we ratified the optional protocol. Now the question is that the optional protocol is saying that indeed the committee cannot consider cases which concern violations which took place before the entry into force, unless the the situation continues. The situation of violations continues, or the violation continues after the entry into force. And we had cases like that before the committee when we interpreted that, for example, if somebody has been deprived of some social payments, okay, before the entry into force of the protocol for the country, but this deprivation continues after the entry into force, and it still constitutes, in view of the complainant, the violation of the covenant, then we think that the case can be considered, the complaint can be considered by the committee against the view of the and reservations made by the government. And this happened already in some cases. So we are taking an approach which, in fact, well, there is a Latin, but we are talking about law, and this is always a reference to Latin is sometimes helpful. There is something in Latin, in dubio pro individual. It means in the case of doubts, we should take a position protecting the individual. Okay, so this is the second point. And third, you know, our problem is not so much the small number of complaints. Our problem is rather a low level of ratification of the actual protocol, because we have now 24 parties to the protocol. And I am appealing to you in your countries, please be advocates of the ratification of this protocol, because this is extremely important. This really opens the way for people to get some protection. How it happens, or cases which were decided in favor of the individuals, I would say in the majority of cases which have been decided so far, there are not too many, unfortunately. I think 12 or 13. The large majority are cases in favor of the individual. You can find all these cases on the screen. You have to go to ohchr.org, and when you have the site of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, you have one of the points where you have the human rights bodies, one of the windows. You are opening the human rights bodies, and you are going down to treaty bodies. When you open the treaty bodies, then you have the abbreviations of all treaty bodies, and you are just clicking on Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. This is an abbreviation. And when you have the site of the committee, by the way, I sent you in this case which I sent to you, I quoted the site of the committee, so it's easy to find. You have on the left-hand side, you have the different entries, and one of the entries is recent jurisprudence. Just open the recent jurisprudence and you get all the cases so far considered by the committee, also these cases which have been declared inadmissible. And in these cases, when you have, again on the right side, you have in cases which have already been decided upon, you have the word views. And views means that the committee concluded the consideration of the case and issued a decision. So you can find easily decisions which, in fact, have been issued in favor of the complainant. This is what I can advise.
We're running short of time, but we've still got 2 questions. But maybe I'll just ask the 2 people to give their questions together, and then we'll give just like 5 minutes for Professor Dzidek to answer them.
Before that, may I just tell you one thing which is very interesting, I think, in the work of the committee. Just, sorry, Mike, but I think it's important to know. The committee is entitled to issue so-called interim measures, is entitled to ask the government to issue the interim measures. We are usually cutting it short and saying interim measures. What does it mean? That if a complaint is coming to us and is prima facie admissible and is prima facie, let's say, reasonably justified, then if the complainant asks for this sort of request from the committee to the government to take interim measure to stop some action, for example, eviction, then the committee, after short consideration, is issuing this sort of request or refusing to do it. And we have got more than 150, I think, requests for interim measures concerning primarily, almost all of them, the issue of eviction. And false eviction or eviction in general, very often linked to the issue of mortgage and this sort of stories. And this, because majority of these cases came from, this request came from Spain. Spain even approached us at a certain moment, saying, well, we are in fact continuously on the agenda of the committee, but it is not that easy to resolve all these questions. But I must say that after discussions with the government of Spain, the government really launched a very, I would say, effective action in order to deal with these interim measures in an efficient way. And I must say I'm pretty respectful for steps taken. The steps were taken, in fact, as a result of this request coming from the committees. Sorry, Mike.
It's okay. So, Sidra, do you want to ask your question and then Noon?
Thank you so much. It's really a privilege to have like a Professor Dzidek in our class. My question is like that I'm very interested to know that what is the composition of the committee, how it has been selected, what is the hierarchy, and what guidelines that they when someone individually approach them, and how they have to investigate or go with the inquiry or for like a fact finding maybe. So what is the resource that we can see and we get to know about the TORs or any guidelines that how committee works? If something briefly you can share, or maybe you can just link us to some resource link that we could read ourselves. So this is my interest towards the committee, and I feel very empowered when I know that some individual person can reach to some committee members. So being a human rights defenders, I feel really empowered to know that it can be somewhere heard. Thank you.
Great. And Noon, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, Professor Dzidek. I would like to ask you about the current issues, which is the COVID-19. Like, if we can see from the statistic of the case and the deaths in Europe, so it's quite a big number, and those countries, like those who have the high rate of the fatalities, most of them, they have the universal health care. So in this case, does it mean that those states, they fail to provide right to health to their own people? And I mean, during the COVID-19, and what would be the prevention for the future if there will be another new disease or another pandemic issues? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for both questions, and briefly to both of them. the question of the election of the members of the committee, this is, you know, the format of election of the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights is exceptional in comparison with other treaty bodies. And this is a residual effect of the debate starting in 46, 47 of the last century, when there was a clash about the nature of economic, social, cultural rights. And the many, mainly Western countries were saying, well, economic, social, cultural rights, in fact, were not rights, they were just aspirations, and we cannot talk about legal entitlements in this case. And consequently, they decided to establish a different, in comparison with others, with other treaty bodies, a different format of the implementation mechanism. Then it was now the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, as a result of changes introduced by ECOSOC, has the same status as other treaty bodies. But initially, it was the ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council of the UN, an intergovernmental body which was in fact monitoring the implementation. And this ECOSOC decided to establish the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. So our committee does not have, let's say, the basis in the covenant itself, although the optional protocol is speaking already about the committee, so it has a life in international treaties. But the last, I would say, the last difference which still exists in comparison with other treaty bodies is that the members of the committee, because it was established by the ECOSOC, are elected by ECOSOC. And this has serious consequences because ECOSOC acts like an intergovernmental bodies of the UN on the basis of regional composition. This means seats in bodies which are elected by ECOSOC are allocated to regional groups. And now we have, in the case of other treaty bodies, the members are elected just by the state parties without any regional allocation. In our case, we have 4 seats for Asia Pacific, 4 seats for Africa, 4 seats for Latin America and Caribbean, and 3 seats for Western group and others, and Eastern European group each. This means that this has a consequence, because in fact, if the regional group agrees that about the candidates, and the number of candidates is equal to the seats available for the regional groups, we are dealing with so-called clean slate. Yeah. In such a case, there is no voting in ECOSOC. It's just information by the chairperson that these are the 2 candidates for 2 seats, no voting, and it is approved. This means that, let's say, the political arrangements can play a very important role. And this is not healthy. And this is not healthy, let's be serious. This is the reason for which some members of the committee are sitting on the committee for many, many, many years. The General Assembly, discussing the changes in treaty body system in 2014, decided to recommend in its resolution to state parties of, or to recommend to the to ECOSOC, sorry, to transfer the competence to elect the members of the committee to state parties. But this decision has not been taken yet. So this is where we are as far as membership is concerned. How it happens in practice? In practice, this means that the candidates are nominated by states. This is always the case. But then initially they are discussed in the regional groups. And the process goes on as I described it. So it is not a perfect process, to say the least. The question of inquiries, the optional protocol establishes as the possibility for the committee to start inquiries into serious and systematic human rights violations on the ground when the committee just learn about this sort of violations. But only 4 out of 4 or 5, I don't remember now exact number, out of the 24 states who have ratified the optional protocol ratified this procedure, because this, in order to enter the commitments under the inquiry provisions of the protocol, the state must ratify it specifically, and this is happening not very often. Up to now, we don't have any practice in this respect, because in the states which have ratified this procedure, we haven't noted any information indicating that there are mass and systematic violations of economic, social, cultural rights. This is as far as inquiries are concerned. The inquiry procedure is a very interesting process. It is being applied by the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination already. But we haven't started it yet. So we also haven't had any missions to the countries, to state parties so far. I'm expecting that this contact on the ground, that they will take place in the future, because state parties are talking about it even outside the inquiry procedure, as just as a sort of inspection missions. With regard to Syria, is this okay? If you will have questions, you can always send a question to me by mail. Mike has my coordinates.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
COVID-19, we have already, we haven't had the opportunity to raise questions concerning COVID-19 with the state parties, because in fact, the real outbreak of the pandemic took place when the committee finished its session, last session. So it's what we did. We issued, together with other treaty bodies, a statement on COVID-19 and human rights, and we issued also our own statement of the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights on the COVID pandemic. In these statements, we have already indicated some of the issues which probably could be also taken into account when we will be facing other pandemics of this sort. And what is very interesting, I think, in general, I would like also to draw your attention to the issue of retrogressive measures. Because during the pandemic, you have on the one hand, the need for the protection of rights of people, of the right to health, of the right to health. Definitely this is an issue of protection of this right, of non-discrimination, disrespect, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the fighting against this sort of disasters always requires some interventions in the human rights area. Now the question, how to keep this intervention balanced with the actual needs and not allow the authorities to go too far again in this respect. So I would like to draw your attention to this COVID-19 statement of the committee. Again, you find it, everything you find on this site of the committee as I described it, and to the statement of all committees on COVID-19. On the other hand, I would like to draw your attention to an interesting document. It is under the statements, and on the site of the committee, under the statements, you have a letter to state parties issued by the chairperson of the committee. This was, in fact, the committee's letter to state parties in 2012, which concerns austerity measures, in fact, retrogressive measures. It was related to the economic and financial crisis after the Lehman Brothers collapse, but it is explaining the general doctrine of the committee concerning retrogressive measures. And I think it would be very useful if you could read it, because it contains 4 very simple conditions which must be met if the retrogressive measures or interventions into the economic, social, cultural rights can be seen still as compatible with the covenant. Thank you. I think that this helps, okay?
Yeah, that's great, thanks. And thanks for spending that extra time. And I think now we'll draw it to a close. And so for the students, I can email the details and email out Dzidek's email address as well if you have further questions. But I'd really want to say thanks, a special thanks to Dzidek for this spending time with us. And it's really, one of the very rare times I've had an opportunity to talk to people on the committees that we learn so much about. We don't have a chance to see what it's like from the other side. So many thanks for that, and thanks everyone. And also this will be recorded and put up on the Google Classroom, and I'll send a link to you, Dzidek, as well about this. Okay.
I just wanted to thank you for once again inviting, but also for this discussion. It was discussion by very knowledgeable friends and colleagues. And Sida said that you are privileged. It is me who is privileged. Believe me. It was great to be with you, and sorry that we all have time limits, but I still hope that we will have another opportunity to meet in one or another context. Yes. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best, and all the best also, not only personally, but also in your work for human rights. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, bye-bye everyone. I'll close the meeting now.